Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Daily Gwei Refuel, where I recap the latest news in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm your host, Anthony Sassano, and today's the 20th of July, 2022. Alright everyone, let's get into it. So Polygon's zkEVM was just announced about, I guess, like an hour ago or something like that now at time of recording. And this is a big announcement. You can kind of like check out this little video they did in this thread. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. But basically what it is today is that they've kind of like open sourced the code for the Polygon zkEVM. It's still very early days here. It's not EVM kind of like equivalent yet. It's not fully EVM compatible yet, but it is basically, on its way to being that. They're going to have a permissionless testnet launching very, very soon, and they're aiming to get mainnet out by the end of 2022, which is quite insane. Now, as I said, like there are different kind of like levels of zkEVM and different levels of kind of like equivalence and compatibility and things like that. Like equivalence is basically so there are technical kind of like specifications here that it has to adhere to, but equivalence is very difficult to achieve as opposed to compatibility because of the fact that you have to account for all the edge cases. You have to account for basically everything, and you have to be strict. You have to basically strictly adhere to the EVM spec. That's why there's EVM compatibility, which is what Arbitrum currently has. And with Nitro, it brings them even closer to equivalence. And then you have Optimism, which has kind of like equivalence. And then there are kind of like benefits to each approach there. But the, I guess, goal with a zkEVM is really like, I mean, one of the initial goals, probably not like the long-term goal, but one of the initial goals is really to give people or give developers the ability to kind of like port their EVM applications to a zkEVM from mainnet or from kind of like an optimistic rollup or something like that, or build kind of like EVM applications without having to change much at all. Like you definitely want to make it as compatible as possible and hopefully get towards that full equivalency eventually. Now, none of that is kind of like live today, but the code is open source for the Polygon zkEVM. And as I said, there'll be a permissionless testnet for people to kind of like play around with very soon, I think in the next couple of months, and then a mainnet hopefully by the end of 2022. So that's the big announcement that Polygon has been teasing for the last, I think, few weeks. It was there, and I watched the live stream here. Jordi Bailina from the Hermes team, the Polygon Hermes team, kind of like walked through this and announced it. And you can see here he kind of like announced that all the code is open source starting today, which is very, very cool. It's kind of like, I guess, a difference to some of the other kind of like ZK teams out there. Obviously, especially Starkware has been kind of like knocked about this before, about how they have like licensing behind some of the stuff that they do with their ZK tech. But when it comes to the Polygon zkEVM, everything is open source, even though it's not even live today. So you can go to the GitHub repository, go through the code, play around with it if you want, clone it, do whatever you want with it, basically, which obviously I think is very, very cool. So that was awesome to see. As I said, you can read this little thread here for more information about this. But yeah, that's basically what was announced today. Now, this obviously isn't the only major kind of like ZK announcement that was happening today. zkSync is also announcing something shortly, I think in the next couple of hours from time of recording. So you may see that announcement before you watch the roll-up, but it hasn't happened yet, so I can't cover it yet. But that's another major announcement that has been teased as well. Probably something got to do with zkSync 2.0, I would assume, considering that they've been working on that for quite a while. But yeah, very, very exciting time for the ZK space right now. I spoke about Scroll's kind of pre-alpha testnet, I think yesterday or the day before on the Refuel. So we've had basically, well, we will have had 3 major ZK related announcements in the same week from 3 very, very kind of like highly respected and highly intelligent teams, scaling teams, and highly kind of like efficient scaling teams, which I really, really love. Which brings me to the final thing I want to talk about this when it comes to scaling, where I put out this tweet where I said, 2022/2023 are going to be absolutely insane for the Ethereum scaling wars. It's what I'm most excited about in Ethereum besides the merge. And you guys know this, like the thing that excites me most besides the Ethereum merge is obviously the scaling wars, or kind of like the scaling improvements that are coming to Ethereum, both at layer 1 and layer 2. Obviously at layer 1 we have proto dank sharding and the dank sharding effort in general, which hopefully we can get the first iteration of early to mid next year. But the layer 2s themselves are basically now, I did say that when Optimism did their token, I felt like that the wars had really kind of like begun, the scaling wars or the roll-up wars, so to speak. But I feel like they're just going to keep like getting more fierce and more fierce, because I mean, when you really think about it, the market opportunity for being kind of like the premier or one of the winning roll-ups is just absolutely mind-bogglingly massive, right? It's just crazy big, and it's not just crazy big from kind of like a market perspective and from like a token valuation perspective potentially, but it's also crazy big for these teams who want to build something that changes the world, right? Like from a social kind of perspective there as well. So the scaling wars are going to keep heating up, as these teams do more tokens. Obviously, zkSync has announced they're doing a token. Starkware has announced they're doing a token for Starknet. Optimism's token is live. Matic token is obviously live. You have Arbitrum, which hasn't announced they're doing a token yet, but like I feel like they will. And something like Scroll as well. And there's I think a couple of the smaller kind of like roll-ups out there, or layer 2s out there as well. And even Immutable X, which is built using Starkware's technology, as a token too. So the wars are going to get more and more fierce as time goes on, especially as we have kind of like tokens for these things now. But the wars don't have to be kind of like, I guess, violent and negative. They can be very, very positive, because it means that all these teams are in competition with each other, and they're kind of like incentivized to outcompete, the other kind of solutions out there. So, for example, Arbitrum ran their Odyssey event, and obviously they hit kind of like the limits of their network because they're waiting for the Nitro upgrade to go live. Well, that could potentially be an opportunity for another chain to kind of like play off of. I haven't seen any other the chains play off of that at this point in time, but those sorts of things are definitely going to become more common, I think. And I think at the end of the day, I think I've said this before on the Refuel, where I said that the technology to scale, especially via a roll-up, will eventually become commoditized. Like block space would just become commoditized, or at least Ethereum block space will be. And the strengths of these kind of like platforms will really be dictated by the business development and marketing at the end of the day. And you guys know I've said before that I think that Polygon has probably the best business development in the kind of like ecosystem today, but that doesn't have to always be the case. These other teams can definitely ramp up. I mean, I think Arbitrum has done a phenomenal job on their business development side. Optimism is definitely catching up now as well. They had a slow start, but they're definitely catching up. The other teams, I mean, Scroll isn't live yet, so they're not really, there's no point really doing any business development or marketing at this point in time. And Polygon Solutions, right, they only really have the POS chain, which is where the majority of usage is, but they're going to take all that experience, they're going to take all that kind of like partnerships that they've built up over time and port that to their zkEVM kind of like implementations as well. So there's just so much going on here, guys. Like the wars are going to get so heated, and as I said, like we're going to get to a point where block space or Ethereum block space is commoditized. It's going to get so cheap as well with proto-dank sharding. Like the numbers that I've seen are just crazy. The fact that we're going to collapse costs by 50 to 100x for layer 2s is just going to be insane. And then builders will be able to kind of like build whatever they want at the end of the day, right? They'll be able to kind of build on actual scalable infrastructure that we haven't had before. I mean, people always say, oh, it's always been the year of scaling for Ethereum. It's like, yes, it has, but they're different kind of like years. I mean, the early days were literally just figuring out how and what to build and what is actually going to work. We went from state channels like Raiden to something like Plasma to rollups now, right? And now we're, within rollups, we have different types of rollups. We have optimistic rollups, we have zk rollups, and then in that we have different kind of like optimistic rollups and different zk rollups. You have zk rollups that aren't EVM compatible or equivalent, and you have ones that are. You have optimistic rollups that are basically the same, and you have different solutions. You have some that are kind of like fully private, some that aren't, and there's just kind of like a world of opportunity here for teams to build out whatever technology they want and just outsource their security and the infrastructure on the security and consensus side to Ethereum. So we're going to see more and more of these things come online. And as I said before, I think that the industry really has a lag of about 6 to 12 months when it comes to just kind of like funding and building the right things. You're probably seeing over the last couple of months, there's been a bunch of new layer ones get announced. I think a couple of them are named Aptos and Sui or something like that, or I don't know how to pronounce it. You guys know my pronunciation of words is absolutely terrible, but there's been those two, and I think there's been another one that I just am forgetting right now. But I think that the reason why these things are kind of like being unveiled now and being shilled now is because they probably came to ideation 6 to 12 months ago when the alt layer 1 trade was really hot. And now, the people that are investing in these things have already committed to it. The people who are building these things have already committed to it. And maybe they realize that layer 2's the future and they should have built a layer 2 instead, but they have to give the layer 1 play a go, I think. So I think what's going to happen is we're still going to see these layer ones that kind of like were ideated on 6 to 12 months ago, but going forward in the next 6 to 12 months, I think we're going to see more and more layer twos come online because it's just, for all the reasons I've outlined before, it just makes much more sense to spin up a layer 2 than it does a layer 1. And there's also kind of like the app chain thing as well, but I don't really think that's going to take off. I think the app chain stuff is definitely a niche. I don't think I'm not bought into the thing that we're going to have like thousands, tens of thousands of different blockchains, all with their own app, app-specific blockchains. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to have, some small set of like really big generalized platforms with maybe a long tail of app chains, but most of them not really doing anything at the end of the day, because we already have that within the industry, right? Like we have like a long tail of alt layer ones that do nothing, that have like zero long-term sustainable adoption. And we have a lot of them that were kind of like around in 2017 and 2018 that were huge back then, or at least kind of like relatively big back then, and are just non-existent today. So I don't really buy into that whole app chain kind of like thesis there. And I don't think that, and I think people who kind of like want it to happen or are trying to make it happen are literally trying to force it into reality, and they're not willing to accept that it's just not the right model, or just not the model that's going to succeed. Obviously, still early days, but I really don't think that, that long-term anything can compete with mature roll-ups because they're just such a vastly better technology and a vastly better solution for so many people out there. But yeah, anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing how the scaling wars play out over the next couple of years. Definitely think it's going to be fierce. It's going to be fierce competition. There is probably going to be some toxicity, as there always is with these sorts of things. But I think it's going to be overall a net positive because competition breeds innovation. It lets people kind of, I guess, develop things without kind of resting on their laurels as well. And we're going to see some big winners emerge. That's for sure. All right, so an interesting tweet thread from Crypto Texan today I just wanted to highlight, where he started out by saying, here are 8 misconceptions about the merge on Ethereum that you should know. Now, I'm not going to read all 8 of these out. I have discussed each of them on the refill before, of course, but this is a really great thread to send kind of like your friends, or send anyone that's asking you, anyone that you see that doesn't actually understand kind of like what the merge is and has these bad narratives in their head. So for example, obviously the first bad narrative or misconception here that Crypto Texan highlights is people believing that the merge reduces gas fees. I've described in the past of why that's not the case, right? That is probably the most prevalent one, I think, out there, but that's definitely kind of like not the case. And then, I'm just going to pick a couple more from random here. Kind of like one here about, staking APR tripling after the merge. It's not going to triple after the merge. I've said before, guys, like, I think that, at most it could go from, maybe 50 to 100% after the merge, depending on fee revenue and depending on MEV. That's kind of hard to calculate. But that's definitely a misconception that I've seen floating around. There's kind of like, there's the popular ones and there's kind of like the ones that don't get brought up as much, but are still worth kind of like talking about, such as, the merge resulting in downtime of the chain. Like, that's just not going to happen. A successful merge basically means the chain never stops running, blocks never stop being produced. It's just one block is proof of work, and the next block is proof of stake, and then proof of work is gone forever. So I just wanted to highlight this thread. I highly recommend giving it a read. I always love kind of people other than me, obviously, putting together this sort of stuff. And, there's just like a small handful of people that usually put together these things, but having people that aren't those small handful putting together and kind of like spreading the word here is really, really great. So really appreciate Crypto Texan for putting out this thread. I think it's great. I'll link it in the YouTube description below for you to check out. All right, so a fresh tweet from Superphiz today, which is basically a reminder that Ethereum validators will not be able to use Infura after the merge for their kind of like execution layer obligations. So if you are a solo validator, solo staker, you run any of that kind of infrastructure on your own, then you need to set up your own full execution client. As I've said before, you can set up Geth, but ideally you'll be setting up Aragon, Besu, or Nethermind, which are the minority clients here, because you won't be able to outsource this responsibility to Infura or Alchemy after the merge. So just another reminder out there. Like, I want to keep reminding people of this, especially if you're a solo if you are a solo validator, you don't have to worry about this if you're kind of like staking with a service provider or anything like that, because they have to worry about that, and make sure you remind them about that too, just to be safe. But if you are a solo validator, you need to do this, and ideally you want to do it now. Don't wait 2 months until the merge happens and then do it, because there could be an issue with your setup. There could be kind of like a sync time may take longer than you anticipated, and you don't want to kind of like be offline when the merge happens, obviously. So you definitely get that kind of like full node sync now. It's very easy to do. Spin up any of these clients and you can do it on your staking kind of like PC. I mean, I've obviously already done mine. Very proud runner of Nethermind. I don't run Geth. Obviously, I want to contribute to client diversity here, so I'm running Nethermind. Works well. Like, I haven't had any issues with it. So yeah, if you are a kind of solo validator, definitely make sure to spin up your own execution layer client from using one of these pieces of software. All right, so speaking of, I guess, like staking here, EthStaker is running a kind of like webinar, I think, or a workshop on the merge, and are you prepared for the merge as a solo staker? So as I was just discussing, there's a bunch of things that solo stakers need to do. One of them is running an execution layer client for the merge, but there are other things that you need to do as well. And I've talked about the merge readiness checklist before, and obviously I have talked about kind of like the things that entails. But if you're still unsure, if you're still not kind of like confident with it, then you can join this EthStaker merge prep validator workshop, which is happening on Friday, July 29th at 11 a.m. EDT. And I think there's also going to be, this should also be recorded, so you can probably watch this if you can't make that time. But as it said here, this is a great opportunity for solo stakers to prepare for and ask questions about the merge. And this is run by the EthStaker community. You're not going to get people better than the EthStaker community to ask these questions to, really. At the end of the day, they are on top of everything when it comes to staking. So you should definitely check out this workshop. The full details can be found in this linked post here. And I'll link this tweet in the YouTube description below for you to kind of access that post. All right, so a couple of updates from Argent here today, or tweets from Argent here today. So there's been a new update for Argent X. They've added fiat values for tokens and a more detailed transaction screen. So if you have been using the Argent X wallet on kind of like desktop, I guess like on web browser, well, now you can see the dollar value of your holdings, which is just a really great quality of life feature, obviously. Seeing the amount of tokens you have is all well and good, especially when it comes to like a stable coin. Obviously, you can just quickly do the dollar conversion in your head. Maybe not to your local currency if you're not in USD, but you can do the USD conversion obviously instantly. But when it comes to like ETH or another kind of like asset that is volatile, that is not kind of easy to calculate, well, obviously you want that detail to be there. And then there's also detailed transactions on the kind of like second pane you can see here, and send transaction, some more information there. So just a cool little update on Argent X. And the second tweet they put out, which is another little update here, they kind of said, Vitalik once said, the internet of money should not cost 5 cents per transaction. We agree. That's why we came up with a solution. With your Argent zkSync account, sending crypto to anyone anywhere in the world costs just 2 cents. Fast, cheap, and borderless, the future of money. I've talked about this at length before, about how these interfaces that sit on top of layer 2s and other and kind of like protocols and DeFi protocols on Ethereum, what is going to kind of like be our window, maybe most people's kind of like window and front door into the world of crypto. And Argent is like at the forefront of that. Their mobile wallet app is super easy to use, super user friendly. They're very focused on UI UX, and they're always kind of like improving it. And obviously, having ultra cheap transaction fees is kind of like a must for the regular user. When you really think about the people that are willing to pay the transaction fees on Ethereum, there are obviously a bunch of different groups. But if you exclude, the MEV chasers, you exclude the whales, and you kind of like exclude maybe the people who are not doing maybe not doing MEV, but doing kind of like related things to that, to kind of like take advantage of inefficiencies within the chain. If you exclude all of that and just think of like the quote unquote normal people, they're not going to be spending like $10, $20, $50, $100 on fees. Like nowhere near that, guys. Like that is seriously for just the people who are involved in the ecosystem and who are, maybe making money by spending that much on fees. Like for example, if you have an airdrop waiting for you and it's worth $1,000 and it costs you $100 to claim that airdrop, well then obviously it makes sense for you to claim the airdrop. It's a free $900 profit. So from that perspective, that's all fine and dandy for us who are in the ecosystem, but there are a lot of people who will never get these airdrops because they just don't, maybe they don't farm them, they don't use the right applications or anything like that. And these kind of people are just using this technology from a pure like normie standpoint, for lack of a better term, where they're just coming in with basically no knowledge of the ecosystem and they're just trying to get some kind of value out of it, such as maybe earning a yield on their stable coins or kind of like buying some ETH with fiat using kind of like a wallet like this instead of using a centralized exchange. That when you kind of like think about that is where it really hits most kind of like users. And that's why I think something like Argent doesn't work on Ethereum kind of like layer 1 at all. Like it's not something that is sustainable on there, and that's why they've been kind of like on the forefront of adopting these layer 2 solutions. And even obviously 2 cents is not cheap enough, and definitely not the cheapest that we can get it. Like it's cheap enough for, I guess, maybe the people in first world, maybe the middle class people, but for people who are living in maybe third world countries and people who are definitely kind of like not middle class, right? Like below middle class or something like that. That racks up very, very quickly if they want to get involved with this technology, and if we want this technology to actually improve those people's lives. So we need to get the costs to basically pennies on the dollar, and then basically free. Like free isn't actually free. Free would be subsidized by the platforms themselves, and they'd make money elsewhere. But for them to offer that, then we need the kind of like ultimate kind of like fee to be essentially free when you think about it. And we're going to do that with kind of like sharding and a bunch of other things, right? To improve these layer 2 solutions for the fees to get really, really cheap. But until that happens, we probably won't get like the mass adoption. I really do think that the only way we get true mass adoption and kind of like mass sustainable and long adoption is by collapsing the fees to the point where it's actually economically viable for the platforms to just subsidize the fees for their users. So the users don't ever see fees. Because at the end of the day, like there are obviously fees attached to a lot of the traditional system and a lot of the things that we use in our everyday lives, but most of them are not fees that are percentage based. Most of them are kind of like flat fees, right? When you really think about it. So if you're doing kind of like if you're doing kind of like a fee, a buy on like a brokerage or something, depending on who you go with, it's probably, I mean, it can vary, right? But like, it's like a flat fee, for example, that you pay, or like for example, a merchant fee on using kind of like FPOS transactions in Australia. I think it's like 30 cents or something per transaction. So it's not like a percentage based thing. It's kind of like a flat fee. So when you think about that, that's not the same when it comes to Ethereum fees. They vary wildly. Obviously, the transactions that use more gas will cost more and all that sorts of stuff. So just collapsing all those costs down, getting it to the point that these teams can subsidize these sorts of things, just vastly improves the user experience and allows them to essentially have a seamless kind of like experience with all these sorts of tools and not be scared off, and still inherit the security of Ethereum, of course. That's obviously one of the most important things. But yeah, I think that's when we get like actual mass kind of like adoption. But until then, we're going to keep improving. We're going to keep working on it. We're going to keep iterating on all these sorts of stuff. And teams like Argent are definitely going to keep improving their solutions as well in order to onboard more and more people into the crypto ecosystem. All right, so speaking of MEV, the Mev-boost landing page has gone live. It provides a one-stop shop for everything you need to know about Mev-boost. Now, I've spoken about Mev-boost before. It's basically the implementation that you'll be using if you're running a solo validator in order to kind of like capture MEV post-merge. Now, you can kind of see on this website, it's got a short explanation of what Mev-boost is, what kind of like consensus clients it is currently compatible with, what the node operators are ready, so which ones are currently using it, and a bunch of other things here, as well as an FAQ. So as I said before, this is part of the merge readiness checklist. If you are not running Mev-boost today, or if you haven't kind of like looked into this and you run a solo validator, it's probably well worth your time to look into this, simply because you'd be leaving money on the table if you don't. MEV could potentially account for a rather large boost to your kind of like staking returns, due to the fact that it is a rather large part of, I guess, like miner returns today, but it's harder to quantify simply because it doesn't flow into the kind of like APR or anything like that. It just kind of like flows to the miners, and it's kind of like on a best guess estimate of like how much MEV flows. Like, I'm not sure if it'll be like that much easier to calculate this stuff post-merge, but it should definitely be easier. So, and as I mentioned yesterday, we're probably going to see big variances in the amount of ETH people are making from staking, or the amount of APR they're getting, simply based on MEV and kind of like also a fee revenue too. You know, there's going to be some validators, funny enough, that will probably set their fee recipient address to something that's not their kind of like own address. Maybe it's it's the protocol guild, for example. Like, I thought about this myself as well. Like, do I want with some of my validators to set the fee recipient address and the MEV recipient address to the protocol guild? So, you know, I have all these validators spun up. I'll have, like, you know, some of them going to me, some of them going to protocol guild, some of them going elsewhere. you can do that. That's the flexibility of it, which is, in my mind, really, really cool. But I'm curious to see how many people do that and what that kind of like landscape looks like as well. But yeah, maybe that's going a little bit off topic, but you should definitely check out Mev-boost. You can kind of go to this. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. But the URL is boost.flashbots.net if you want to check it out there as well. All right, finally, here we have Kevin Owoki's TLDR of his FCC talk, which was the announcement of kind of like Gitcoin Passport here, which is the first decentralized protocol rolled out by Gitcoin DAO, and it enables any dApp to use Gitcoin grants Sybil resistance. So you can go to gitcoin.co/passport to kind of like check this out, and you can also read Owoki's thread here for his TLDR. But essentially, with Gitcoin Passport, it is, and they're calling it, a transportable proof of personhood identity for the Web3 space. You can earn rewards by proving your personhood on any integrated dApp, leverages the same identity you already use on Gitcoin grants, and there's an open source SDK in alpha to integrate with apps today. I've talked about decentralized identity and reputation systems before, and about how whoever solves this, whoever provides the right solution for this, is kind of going to win big here, because it is a holy grail kind of thing where it's like we obviously need decentralized identity. We need to be able to differentiate between like who's a bot, who's kind of like a real person, who's pretending to be a real person, not necessarily a bot, right? Who's pretending to be like, say you have like 3 Anon accounts and it's just one person controlling that, right? But there's also the kind of like thing of giving identity to these Anons. You can create your own new identity based on your Ethereum activity, for example. So just to pick out one random Anon who everyone knows, Degen Spartan, for example, right? Like everyone knows who Degen Spartan is on Twitter, but as far as I know, no one actually knows who they are in real life. They've managed to protect their identity pretty well. But the thing is that shouldn't stop them from being able to have an on-chain or on Ethereum identity, and they will be able to with something like Gitcoin Passport, where they can use their accumulated kind of like on-chain, Twitter reputation, and kind of like pull that all together in order to have something like a Gitcoin Passport, which I think is very, very cool. Because at the end of the day, like just because it's an Anon account doesn't mean that it's not a real person. Like I said, yes, obviously if someone can create and manage multiple Anon accounts, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that there's obviously a real person in charge of Degen Spartan or managing the Degen Spartan persona and account, and that person shouldn't be barred from things just because they're not kind of like doxed, for example, and there's not kind of like a human that who's behind the account. So I think from that perspective, we definitely need things like this. And it also helps that things like this also help to kind of like weed out all of the, I guess, like bots and Sybil kind of like attempts from other people out there, so that you can't just kind of like keep creating accounts and keep having the same influence and same power as someone who has proved their identity and proved who they are through the Gitcoin Passport, and build up this kind of like reputation over a longer period of time. So I think that all that sort of stuff is very, very cool. But don't listen to me ramble on about it. You should definitely check out this kind of like thread from Kevin here. It definitely explains it. And I think at the end of the thread, he also links to his talk on YouTube, which you should go check out if you don't want to read the thread, and though if you want more context on things as well. I think this is just the very beginning of kind of like this sort of stuff, this proof of personhood, this decentralized identity and reputation. And I think this is going to be extremely important going forward, especially for things like decentralized social media and Web3 things more, generally. And I think that it's also going to play a big part in something like DeFi as well, because hopefully we can get to a point where we can do under-collateralized lending, where you can actually have the concept of credit come to DeFi without having to do KYC or anything like that. You have kind of like your Gitcoin Passport, and that gives you a certain level of trust, and you can have kind of like an uncollateralized lending as well, which I think would be very, very cool. But anyway, on that note, I think that's going to be it for today. So thank everyone for listening and watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the newsletter, join the Discord channel, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.